Hi, everybody. It's nice to see such a full house for Shannon's first lecture. Thanks for coming tonight. I think I know most everyone in the room, and you've probably all seen me stand at the podium before, but I see just a few faces, so welcome. My name is Sarah Turner. I'm the Associate Director at the Academy, and it's always nice when we have some folks coming from off campus to join our lectures. Thanks for finding your way to Sal Auditorium tonight. We've really only been together a few weeks, and already I can sense that people are getting settled into their studios and into their work. And so it's right about that time, after I've waited a little bit, and these rhythms are starting to develop, that I add just a little bit more to what you're already doing. And that begins tonight with the program of Critical Studies. Most of you heard me introduce our visiting fellow, Shannon Stratton, at Academy Day. So you already know that Shannon has a great deal of experience in curating, teaching, and a variety of creative enterprise from her work as the founder and executive director of threewalls, which is an organization for artist residencies, research, and exhibitions in Chicago. You already know that Shannon also teaches in the Art History, Theory, and Criticism Department and the Fiber and Material Studies Department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she also graduated. She's a graduate of their program. And by now, you may have looked into one of Shannon's projects, which I mentioned on Academy Day, which was the phone book, to find listings of independent and artist-run projects all over North America. They're really beautiful little books, and they're in our library, so I'm recommending them for a second time. And you may have read about Shannon. I know that you do your homework and your research, and as a leader in visual arts in Chicago, people are talking about Shannon and very aware of her work. But in introducing Shannon, it's not only her bio that's important, but the work in the field that she's a part of right now. Through her many varieties of art-centric projects, Shannon has become a kind of expert on artist-run, artist-initiated, new formats, old formats, arts in the city, arts in the country, organized by smart, you and me kinds of projects. But projects like these don't look for experts, actually, and I don't think Shannon would call herself one of these. They look for workers and doers and thinkers and makers, and those things I feel sure that we can call Shannon. Shannon has come to town to talk to us about her ideas and projects in a place that really is already at work on these kinds of things, Cranbrook and Detroit. Cranbrook is a home for art students, and many of you already know how to work this way. And when I say this way, I really mean any way. At Cranbrook, Patrick Gantert ran a clean and poorly lighted space gallery. Megan Harris cited collaborations with Cave Gallery into the Hangar and organized a series of performances. With Cranbrook's support, Kate Drodrell launched Detroit Soup. In his studio, Paul Outlaw opened a bodega. And most recently, like right now, the Vessel and Page project has opened in Pontiac. So this is all to say that this place and this time is very ready for Shannon's ideas. For you, she may be a thinking partner, a mentor, a model. She may be someone who you look to bring solid research and experienced practice as she looks forward on her own new projects while she's here. She's here for a short time, and I know it will be a rich time, and it will certainly be a busy time. So I hope that you will look for the ways that her projects link with your ideas, and that you'll seek her out, follow her example in ways that are different and, of course, particular to you and your own work. And even though we're only starting, I can already see that we're going to need to have Shannon back. So Shannon, welcome.
Hi. Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. I am really excited about being the Critical Studies Fellow here this fall. And even though I haven't met very many of you yet, I've been kind of in and out of town to Chicago for a couple weeks. Pretty soon I'll be here all the time, and you'll feel like you can't get rid of me, so not to worry. I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce my talk and talk a little bit about what it is and what it's not. I decided when I was thinking about how I wanted to address this first lecture that I really wasn't interested in giving you a history of threewalls or a sort of slide lecture of all of the projects I've been working on. So this lecture isn't that. It's very much an opportunity for me to kind of analyze some of the questions that I have about what artist-run culture is, what professionalization or work in the art world means right now when artists are operating the platforms on which their colleagues are being represented. So this talk is going to be a little bit critical of that role, and more so than it is going to address specific examples of projects. It's also not going to demarcate between different ways artists are working. I'm not going to make hierarchical judgments between things that are more social practice or are more just exhibition related. More detailed kind of look at those kinds of artists or those kinds of platforms, I think I'll take up in the second lecture. So I think of this as being really paired with my lecture on November 6th, which I assume you will come to as well, where I'll start to get a little bit more specific in terms of the kinds of things that I kind of address here more broadly. Also, I'm planning on setting up a reading group while I'm here. That'll be kind of like a mini seminar in artist-run arts administration. In the next week or so, in the Cranbrook email, there'll be an announcement in regards to when the first meeting will be. It'll be an opportunity for a small group of people who are interested in these ideas to get together, do some readings that I'm going to put together into a little zine, and spend some time kind of really unpacking the currents in artist-run work right now. Dig a little bit deeper, maybe do some field trips. I'm thinking of bringing some guests out to spend some time with us. And really thinking that this could be a chance for us, whoever wants to join me, to work together on a project, and I can help facilitate something that might culminate next spring, or you're really at the pace that seems appropriate. So please, if at the end of this talk you're like, yeah, I'm really interested in this stuff, beyond our discussion groups this week, look for that announcement. I'd love to see you join this little mini seminar and work with you this semester on some of your ideas. So, okay, with no further ado, as form, which will end up with a slide. So as form, as I interpret it, is a practice that calls attention to and probably exaggerates our expectations for experience. It's project-based, something that Claire Bishop in Artificial Hells identifies as being crucial to art after 1989, as aspiring to replace the work of art as finite object with an open-ended, post-studio, research-based social process that extends over time and is mutable in form. While arts administration sounds bureaucratic to most ears and is by no means explicitly social practice, although sometimes it can be, when it's enacted by artists in a renegotiation of traditional roles and institutionalized practice, it has the possibility of redefining the role of arts administration from the inside out. Describing this work today as form acknowledges the social turn in art and makes room for projects that exist along a spectrum of activity, objectives, outcomes, and longevity. So personally, I have had a discrete, non-collaborative studio art practice. I've completed an MA in art history, theory, and criticism. I've curated exhibitions alone and with partners, and I've published texts on artist-run culture and craft. But probably what most clearly defines my job at this point is that of arts administrator. So it's funny to me, actually, to be standing up here today and be the person that's been invited to be the Critical Studies Fellow. Cranbrook has invited an arts administrator to be here. I think that's really exciting. The point of that confession is to invite some discussion about the presence or absence of the administrator in critical discussions, and essentially address the growing number of artists who are exploring the role of director, producer, or organizer as the central method of their practice, and treating the work that comes of those roles as form. At its most basic level, these practices are practical. They're about making space for culture. Individually, though, they're as nuanced as a tenting residency called Signal Fire. The Soup Grant Network, started in Chicago by Incubate, this is their How to Start Your Own Sunday Soup poster. And the residency Elsewhere in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is hosted in a thrift store cum living museum. Some of these projects are 501c3 not-for-profits, which essentially means you adhere to a particular tax code, and you're beholden to those rules, and you're beholden to a public. Others are intentionally not organized as businesses at all, and they remain gatherings that exist between the private and public realm. So my argument, like many before me, is that those artist-run realms are sites of real engagement with what is germane to the field. And it should be characterized a lot less often as alternative, which is usually the case, alternative spaces, in the sense that saying so pits them against realms of the art world that are imagined to be more professional and, by extension, more important platforms. A core belief of mine is that artists, like other experts, should function within a culture of peer review, like in so many other fields, and that peer review should extend outside academia to the funding and exhibiting of artists' research. So I know this is not a new conversation. I grew up entrenched in artist-run culture in Canada, where that germinated at the same time it did in the United States, which is about 40 to 50 years ago. But having spent the better part of my adult life in Chicago, I've experienced the urgency with which questions of artist as arbiter are returning to the field, and not just in the Midwest. So curiously, this urgency has kept pace with another trend, the professionalization of the artist, which is reflected in the push to explicitly fund professional development programs on the part of a number of foundations in the country, and also in the number of how to make it in the art world kinds of books that are showing up in bookstores and in MFA programs. So having just read this article in Forbes, literally like 4 days ago, called "Are Creative Careers Now Reserved Exclusively for the Privileged?" This push for professionalism is particularly fascinating to me. I wonder if that push helps artists who come from less economically advantageous backgrounds, or if it simply outlines the same path to success that's become de rigueur in the arts, for survival, in the art world, like expensive graduate school, unpaid internships, and the prohibitive cost of moving to New York City. Or is it possible for artists to redefine the field for themselves? Can artists determine for themselves what makes for a career by being more involved in the process of representing one another? Do they have the power to slow down this looming exclusivity and leave ample room for a diverse group of participants across a much broader terrain? So while I had originally imagined my talks here to be about amateurism more broadly, that's what the statement said, including the popularity of unpacking that term DIY, I found when I was writing this talk that it had become increasingly about negotiating the terms of my practice, which at present straddles both the rather organized foundation of Three Walls and a more unstructured realm of another artist-run space in Southeast Ohio. In the end, this lecture turns out not to be about the history of Three Walls, like I said, or a grocery list of my projects, but it's more of an essay or an attempt at exploring the field through the ways I'm interacting and encountering it right now. I'm wondering what happens in between small, nimble, artist-run realm and the moment a project solidifies into an institution of sorts. I'm curious about the pressure to professionalize alongside the very real need to pay the bills. I'm curious about what art workers are and how capitalism has come to inform a field that should still be a place for utopian, if at least not critical, thinking about the conditions of labor and productivity. So I currently exist within a spectrum between the poles of impermanence and kind of solidifying into permanence. During the academic year, as Sarah pointed out, I'm the executive director of Three Walls, which is a organized 501c3 that I co-founded in 2003. Three Walls started out by hosting residents And then after a decade, we now produce an annual series of solo exhibitions for regional artists. We re-grant about $50,000 a year to artists working as organizers in the artist-run realm. We publish books, we host conferences, we commission multiples, and we collaborate on a grassroots arts fair in Chicago called Midway. So we're turning 10 in June, which totally blows my mind because I can't believe we've actually made it that far. It sounds seriously permanent to me. I spend a lot of my time writing grants. We nearly spend about half of the year planning our spring gala. I'm always trying to figure out how to separate the pocket change from the big art patrons in the city by convincing them that small and artist-run is a exciting thing to participate in. We are always busy herding a lot of cats. We have a board of directors. We have an art advisory committee who selects the shows. We've got juries that we work with in awarding our grants. We have a team of volunteers that swells to about 10 people every school year. But on the flip side of that, in the summer I go to Southeast Ohio and I spend at least 1 month at a tree farm that started out as Herald Arts Residency about 7 years ago. And full disclosure, this is my boyfriend's farm. So when Joe and I started dating, we thought we'd just begin by hosting a group of artists together in August under the loose rubric of the term survival. The theme pretty much instantly fell apart. So that's ironic. But for 3 years, we invited people out for that session, and they always seemed to gel with the site and with one another, regardless of the structure, or lack thereof. Herald started out as a residency 7 years ago, after Joe's grandfather passed away and had left the farmland to his extended family. Initially, he ran that residency as Herald with another group of collaborators, and about 3 years ago, that group split up, and now the project is undergoing reinvention. So I've been participating since that transition. So for me, it makes for a really interesting contrast with the established direction that Three Walls has. On the surface, artist-run spaces suggest two basic drives: a reaction to available opportunities and/or a critique of the institutions that normally provide them. In Chicago, a city with at least 7 major visual arts programs for BFA and MFA programs, there's obviously an overgrowth of artist constituents that would naturally lead to a kind of frustration with access. In 2012, Chicago's home to an ever-growing population of artist-run apartment galleries. Pardon me. And for ease of reference, when I say apartment galleries for the rest of this talk, I am kind of summing up any private venue under that term, whether it's in a studio, in a basement, in a garage, in the back of a van, just private space. And also homespun residency programs, which are where artists are inviting other artists to come and live and make work and do research from their homes, their studios, or their private property. In addition to that, of course, there are blogs, zines, lecture series, small film festivals, free schools, dinner clubs, microgrants, and other formats for making, showing, and supporting new culture. Most of these spaces or projects are funded by the artists or curators who maintain them, and a very few of them make claims for 501c3 status. These spaces or projects open or close, start and stop with some frequency, and some of them don't last any more than 2 events. In addition to responding to the conditions of institutionalized culture and opportunities, I think these spaces also offer a kind of inverted critique of the domestic. These projects are open to a public, whether for one-night-only events, by appointment, or on Sunday afternoons. But by situating themselves in personal domestic space, the apartment gallery and the homespun residency privatize the exhibition and cultural administration, an obvious marker of difference between them and the museum or the established not-for-profit that proposes usually an idea of general access. By advancing a kind of public access to the private realm, these spaces trouble the idea of the domestic. and further to that matter, the idea of the institution, and the value of subjective, intimate relationships to art, but they also simultaneously retreat into a more rarefied realm, one that, despite being stated as open, still requires a kind of inside knowledge to gain access. Apartment galleries and homespun residencies then serve the purpose of dual critique, on one hand addressing those traditional institutions, historical and contemporary museums of art centers with education programs, traditional small not-for-profits, rural art schools or retreats, commercial galleries. They do this through their operation outside of traditional funding streams and methods of administration. On the other hand, they address what the domestic is as a place for assembly and the subjective might be as a site for critical inquiry. Without actually demarcating specific projects as successes or failures, it's interesting to imagine the possible trajectories and how they might be categorized. Does an apartment gallery that establishes itself as a business or as a not-for-profit and gains some footing fail at being transgressive as it adopts the traditional organizational structures and thus, through survival, becomes some kind of an institution? Do domestic spaces best succeed as short-lived ephemeral projects whose story takes on the aura of rumor within the annals of local art communities? Or do these projects simply develop their own kind of institutionalism as the numbers of apartment galleries and other grassroots cultural administration projects swell? Do they adopt new operational formats consistent within their genre, or do they inevitably adopt the rules, norms, and frameworks of traditional institutional structures? I've come to recognize the Artist Run as a kind of artist-serving artists organization, one that steps in between large institutions and commercial galleries. They provide a space for artistic community, support, professional development, and experimentation. On a trip to Montreal for the annual general meeting of Res Artis, I listened to a panel titled The Spirit of Artist-Run Centers. And just side note, artist-run centers have a kind of a stronger support system in Canada. They're more often actually 501c3s and less often apartment or domestic spaces. So this conversation was a lot about funded businesses that are operating as 501c3s. After the panel's presentation, the conversation dissolved into somewhat of a debate, or a series of positions, on what audience a not-for-profit was actually serving. The gist of this debate came down to funding. Funders are interested in numbers served, the demographics of those numbers, and what kind of educational programs centers provide their communities. Between the audience and the panel, it was questioned whether the Artist-Run Center was capable of offering space for true experimentation, or if funding guidelines at this point had them hamstrung. One panelist wondered boldly what was wrong with artists having a place for specialized discourse, and why the artists themselves were not a legitimate audience. What hovered in the air was this kind of unsettling possibility that an artist-run center as a 501c3 may simply no longer be serving its purpose, and that its purpose had become so unclear that it might have become mundane. The question of specialized discourse struck a chord between commercial galleries offering artwork as consumables, as collectibles or entertainment, and not-for-profits forced to shape their programs as service industries. Artists themselves become service providers. In order to receive opportunities or income, they have to provide either entertainment or education. The apartment gallery, temporary or semi-permanent, provides a place for specialized discourse. And what is striking is that, unlike other research-based practices whose predominantly peer-reviewed practice remain unabashedly public, in order for artists to engage in specialized discourse, they have to utilize private space, however open to the public it might be. By engaging the domestic as a space for assembly and discourse, the threshold between public and private is indeed troubled. Is art retreating to the domestic and thus becoming marginalized? Or has the everyday and the domestic been so thoroughly mined by artistic practice that the domestic space is the site of the new institution? If the latter is true, will domestic space remain critical? or will that criticality be transformed by the financial transactions that begin to infiltrate it, like funding for 501c3s operating on private property, or the sale of artwork, or fundraisers, or studio rentals, beer sales, etc.? So last winter, I came across an essay written by Cranbrook's first critical studies fellow, a very good colleague, a very dear colleague of mine, Lane Relier. I read his Dear Radical Artist, Unforgettable You, while standing in the bookstore in the Walker. I was kind of anxious as this argument unfolded because Lane and I had rather civilly debated the term do-it-yourself for a number of years as far as it pertained to the condition of artist-run culture today. Dear Radical Artist begins by taking to task the idea of the platform in art. A term Relier points out is borrowed from the business and engineering world, where the platform is used to describe a point of coordination that is stable but flexible, a loose framework. In Relier's argument, the platform, and further to that, the network, has become more important than the content. He argues that the increasingly decentralized and diffuse art practices that embrace self-publishing, internet sites, artist-run galleries, social events, a long list of other activities loosely defined by him as DIY, are less defiant of than they are cooperative with a neoliberal dismantling of social structure. He argues that DIY glamorizes entrepreneurial initiative and, by extension, the neoliberal agenda of deregulation and the rise of the short-term contract over long-term formal commitments. I'm a social democrat. I was reared in Canada, where social programs are the basis of our political pride. So I am definitely not interested in the evisceration of social structure. But I am prone to favor the ethos of DIY. I like to celebrate amateurism, and I tend towards pragmatism. And I would argue that Relier's claim that networks privilege casual or weak ties over formal commitments. My practice as an administrator, if I'm going to use that traditional terminology, relies pretty heavily on the slow accretion of formal commitments that I acquire through a constant pulsating network. To the region or threewalls serves, to the audiences and foundations that support us, and to the mission that we've formally set in place. And all of those commitments sound kind of boring, and they're to some degree the things that artists often wish to initially avoid in forming presentation projects, but inevitably they reckon with them anyways. They have to negotiate commitment constantly, whether it is to the framework demanded of the 501c3, a for-profit business, or simply to a community whom they're providing resources or content. So maybe that's a possible title for this talk, Commitment as Form. Perhaps ideas of commitment are the basis of what fascinates me about all amateurism. It eventually reaches a liminal space where enough repetition requires its transition less into mastery than into commitment. Promiscuous operators, as Relier describes the mobile and plural practices of many of today's artists, eventually reach a focal point. That focal point is simply found through process and exploration, a learning by doing rather than top-down directives. And perhaps what might appear to be promiscuous is merely the attempt to remain flexible, not born from a lack of commitment, so much as a desire to stay elastic and maintain potentiality. To be able to respond to the needs of one's community, however a group chooses to define it, as those needs arise and with what resources are at hand. Ad hoc doesn't have to mean sloppy. Meanwhile, I think that DIY still fails these practices as a term. As a term, it came into common usage in the 1950s in regards to home improvement projects and perhaps more elaborately in reference to popular mechanics, a really great treasure trove of a magazine dedicated to elaborate building and engineering projects for the basement tinkerer. I could see that initially when the term DIY came back into fashion that it operated motivationally by suggesting an opposition to institutionalized practice. But with the growing numbers of artists with the growing number of artists practicing as organizers, it's no longer adequate. Applying it to those working to provide new platforms for presentation and discourse has the effect of disregarding their competence through the term's more popular association with hobbies. Relia goes on to request more effective forms of defiance, less romanticism, as this expanded agency in his argument has been purchased largely through dismantling social structure. And while I'm on board with less romanticism, I don't see romanticism solely in the work of artists who build outlets for their colleagues. At its most basic, pursuing a degree in the arts is pretty romantic. It's usually hardly attainable, and it's in conflict with the reality of a market that's required to underwrite its current existence. So rather, regardless of the scale of an artist's undertaking, its reach or longevity, I think any group that seeks to create new structures for dissemination is involved in reimagining the possibility of new social structures. Dismissing their work based on scale is to disregard the power of small gestures or the cumulative impact of a network. Relia bemoans that networks elevate the pragmatics of doing over the semantics of meaning, and that the stress on practice devalues theory with profuse pluralism leading to a decay of critical criteria. Perhaps given my training's emphasis in craft, which is my background, I'm pretty quick to assert that doing does not foreclose on meaning, and that when an artist takes on social engagement as their practice, they do in fact build real skill and real craft to do this work. So I very commonly lean on Richard Sennett's The Craftsman a great deal, as he uses the term craftsman to reference a number of different types of practitioners in the world whose work requires the building of tangible skill. In his book, this includes everyone from surgeons to mothers to cooks to glassblowers, and Sennett's stories detail the way thinking and acting like a craftsman can have a sharp social edge, where practice, embodied knowledge, and relational thinking are the skills needed for world-making. He says, both the difficulties and the possibilities of making things well apply to making human relationships. Material challenges like working with resistance or managing ambiguity are instructive to understanding the resistances people harbor to one another or the uncertain boundaries between people. The plurality of practices that Relia is referring to, that is, artists embracing the role as presenter, producer, director, organizer, as readily, if not more so, than that of the independent and somewhat atomized studio artist, relies on a kind of slow building and knotting together of pragmatic skills. And I choose the word knotting in direct relationship to the emphasis on networks, but even more so to emphasize nets. Given the decay of social structures that Relia refers to, artists are forced to design their own safety nets, and they recognize that in designing them for their immediate communities, as a group they test ideas, accrue skills, edit process, and have the potential for modeling best practices back to the institutions who claim to support artists and culture, but whose practices may have become somewhat calcified. In publishing Phone Book, a directory of independent art spaces, I've witnessed the exponential growth of this network of projects, who more and more are looking to one another to build skill and redefine their profession rather than checking in with the academy or the institution. Our last edition, which is this one, and our third edition, has over 800 listings in the United States of projects organized under the headings time, space, place, and resource. Inevitably, we left people out because we didn't find them in time for print. Some of the spaces in the edition will be around for edition 4, others may have ceased programming, and it is this precarity between achieving survival and becoming immutable that I'm concerned about. Not the actual problematics of raising money per se, although I am always concerned about that, but the question of how to be both responsive and nimble without exhaustion, how to be responsive and nimble without exhaustion, and how to be responsible and committed without losing vision, and how to not be lukewarm in the application or deployment of skills that are wrought through social exchange. Arts administration on a grassroots, artist-run level is a curious marriage of cognitive labor and craftsmanship. It is connected to its local community and a labor of communication. The arts administrator is working at the enrichment of experience. So sometimes I think most of my philosophies about art and the public face are so in conflict that they cancel each other out. That my position's kind of in danger of being both too practical and too soft to be of any real political use. For example, on one hand, I naturally defend the very practical administration of three walls to my colleagues who viewed 501c3 professionalization as being dangerously compromised by their means of fundraising and survival. I would insist that the structure provides stability, but also requires responsibility to a public. Those are good things. But on the other hand, as the program outgrows its more humble beginnings, my desire to maintain nimbleness that makes small organizations and projects so relevant is challenged by the checks and balances that emerge out of traditional not-for-profit best practices and stability. I find myself facing our 10-year anniversary with a desire to deprofessionalize, an instinct that in many ways I think I'm 10 years behind on feeling. Faced with a funder last week who is nervous, if not downright in opposition to our recent plans to relocate, we've been in the same place for 10 years, I personally feel myself growing resistant to the few formats available to keeping an organization afloat. An explanation: they were nervous because we have elected to take on this move in the middle of a capacity building program of theirs that we're participating in. Our move falls outside of a 3-year plan that they asked us to write, and therefore they interpret us as now being reactionary and not executing proper planning, and in short, not operating like a good business. The models for which are the countless for-profit businesses that inform the strategies that they want us to adhere to, with little to no flexibility while we complete their program in exchange for major funding. On the other hand, out in Ohio, I'm sitting in a rocking chair and I'm reading. I remember being at another residency sponsored by a patron at her home in Hudson, New York, for the alumni and faculty of the School of the Art Institute. I had gone there with a friend and my collaborator, Judy Lehman, to work on a project that we did called Gestures of Resistance. Most of what we needed was time to do the research and write together. But this patron was really irritated because I was in a hammock reading a book. And to her, I wasn't performing like an artist. I wasn't doing my job. So in Ohio, nobody's watching me. And it's interesting because a few of the artists there think that I'm watching them, and that really freaks me out. An artist I really care about and had invited out one summer took me aside at the end of his residency to apologize for not being more productive. So in Exhaustion and Exuberance, Berlin-based art critic Jan van Wert takes on the pressure to perform, both as a condition of current society and one that artists are increasingly held accountable to. He asks, how can we know what is to be done? It's a tongue twister. How can we know what is to be done to make a better life possible for ourselves and others now and in the future? We face a twofold challenge, he says. One, to understand the conditions of our agency in order to enable us to define them according to our own terms. And two, to imagine another logic of agency, an ethos which could help us defy the social pressure to perform and to eschew the promise of the regimented options of consumption. He goes on to ask, how can we restore dignity to the I can't? How can we embrace the I can't without depriving ourselves of our potential to act? Could we unlock the I can't as a form of agency? How can performing the I can't effectively interrupt the self-contained economic cycle of supply and demand and truly break the spell of the pressure to produce for the sake of production? So, I reserve the right to come to Ohio and not perform, and deprofessionalize, to be disorganized, to reserve the right to literally produce. But that isn't entirely personal and subjective. My refusal is deeply connected to the organization that I'm directing the rest of the year. All of the staff leaves in August. We close. We close because no lives are at stake. And fundamentally, if we cannot find a way to be sustainable without adhering to the common business practices of delivering product or performing services in exchange for money, then we can at least refuse to adhere to the framework for work that has become so common in America in a bid to negotiate a model of sustainability that doesn't enervate our small underpaid staff, or for that matter, drain the attentions of the people we serve. Funders don't underwrite staff salaries. Artists are not part of a robust networked healthcare plan, and there isn't a 401k. In fact, we only very recently have been able to pay staff at all. And in order to keep energized around what we do, it seems important to design our own labor policies in relationship to that work, the audiences we serve, and the actual conditions of our survival. Of course, anyone can argue that it is a privilege to even be paid to participate in cultural production, and often that argument is lobbed against artists. How many of you have had somebody exclaim, "Oh, it must be so great to do what you love"? But martyrdom in the arts is endemic with administrators at institutions large and small, where they all feel some requirement for hyper-performance. This could be in part to strapped budgets and staff capacity, or it could be born out of the very real fear that their roles are not crucial to society. Hyper-performance becomes a neurotic strategy for performing the value of the arts to a public that might not be paying attention to them. After attending a few conferences for administrators and hosting one too, I have witnessed the tendency on the part of all organizers and organizations to anxiously overprogram, hyper-perform in a bid not always for funding, but for respect via productivity. This tendency trickles down to artists themselves, who hyper-perform in order to gain visibility, recognition, and respect in a competitive field. So, how can I talk about commitment as form and simultaneously want the arts to deprofessionalize? Take a step back. Stop trying to overcompensate with anxious overproduction. I'm hopeful that commitment can mean something else. I am hoping that commitment can be to forms that are not forced to ape those asked for by foundations and patrons. I am hopeful that, to quote Jens Hoffman here, that the concept of artist run will not outlive its usefulness so long as it realizes the transgressive potential that it holds within an increasingly professionalized and conformist art world. If this lecture seems to have become increasingly about work, I think it's because art has become increasingly about work. Craft, labor, education, performance, professional practice, artist as entrepreneur, DIY work ethic, amateur versus expert, productivity, these are all the buzzwords. It seems that ever less pleasure and reassurance can be found in human relations, in everyday life, in affectivity and communication. A consequence of this loss of eros in everyday life is the investment of desire in one's work, understood as the only place providing narcissist reinforcement to individuals used to perceiving the other according to rules of competition. Franco Berardi said this in regard to society and work as a whole, but it applies to working at art just the same. The pressures of a competition wrought by art markets made visible at over 180 art fairs worldwide, art schools that cost more than some medical degrees, and institutions that make curatorial decisions based on the collecting interests of their patrons have divested artwork of the eros Berardi longs for. Visual artists are working overtime to respond to market trends. Their cultural production is being driven more and more by bottom lines of the institutions that support their field, even if in doing so they receive no personal support whatsoever. Perhaps one could argue that being responsive to the demands of audiences, as described by museums or commercial galleries, is necessary for survival in a saturated field. Or perhaps you could argue that the increased professionalization, as defined by those forces outside of the artist's studio, foundations, commercial galleries, academia, and so on, are having the effect of defining cultural production in more narrow terms than we'd like to believe. After all, nothing holds wages down like a long line at the gate. And if everyone is going to line up at the same gate, expect the gatekeepers to determine the rules of engagement. Back at the farm. The first critique of places like Herald is one of access. Who gets to come here? Who is this for? If it's private, isn't it therefore elitist? What about the community? Is it engaged with the needs of the surrounding residents? But this place, like the other domestic spaces I mentioned, isn't an institution. It's decided not to be responsible to everyone, and instead is responsible to the artists who use it and its neighbors. It is a place to find balance between the struggle for survival with the need for the joy of a community, even if it only occurs for a few weeks each summer. It's not organized as a high-functioning business, maybe not yet, or maybe not ever. Instead, it exists in that liminal space that studio buildings, reading groups, and underground venues do. The farm resists dictating outcomes and instead simply provides beds, food, and fresh air to a group of artists who make of it what they will. I've come to see that what they will as an important factor for this place. It's an open platform. If you come here, you meet our Amish neighbors, you might karaoke at the local bar, or attend a service at the Quaker Meeting House. You might meet the mayor of Chester Hill, who's a musicologist and teaches in Athens. You might inquire about installing some of your art in an abandoned sign 2 towns over, as Nina Barnett did this summer. Here there is no institutional structure. There are no meeting times or assignments or planned discussions. Participation is elective, yet plenty happens. What they will is a question of trust, a quality that seems to be deeply missing in the highly organized world of arts administration that I've become familiar with. While acting as a 501c3 through threewalls, I do feel responsibility to an audience, a public, our funders and patrons who support us, but I've also learned too well the kind of lack of trust many foundations and patrons feel for the arts. There is an established practice of infantilization that trickles down through checks and balances and don't take into account the often organic nature of artistic process that nearly always bears fruit. So the premise for Herald is a light touch, a trust in the residents to use their time in a way that feeds their work, a trust in the residents to care for and develop a relationship to the site and its neighbors, a trust that these residents are respectful, honest, and generous to each other and everyone who they encounter during their stay. And that trust garners repeat visitors. It garners deepening relationships with our neighbors. It is inspiring projects that are emerging from years of slow, repeated investment in that neighborhood and the natural development of real friendships. A trust and process that bears fruit. So in closing, of course I'm working even when it looks as if I'm not working. And even if I'm not working and it looks as if I'm not working, I still might claim to be working and wait for you to work out what objective signifiers actually point toward any moment of value or work. Thank you, Liam Gillick.